Something is happening in the gardens of experienced rose growers that nobody in the industry wants to explain. Their roses bloom from May through November without a single fungicide spray, without a feeding program, and without the replacement plants most gardeners budget for every other season. The same varieties sold as difficult and disease-prone are thriving on neglect in those gardens while dying on attention in yours. These 20 secrets are the reason why. By the end of this list, the gap makes complete sense. Number 20, stop buying hybrid tea roses if you want continuous bloom. This is where most beginners make the decision that shapes every frustration that follows. Hybrid tea roses are the roses of florists, of Valentine's Day bouquets, of glossy magazine covers, long stems, perfect single blooms. They are also the least forgiving roses in cultivation, prone to black spot, susceptible to frost damage, demanding a fungicide program most gardeners maintain for one season before quietly giving up. The roses that bloom continuously and ask for almost nothing are the repeat flowering shrub roses. David Austin's Gertrude Jekyll opens into a deep, densely cupped pink that looks almost too saturated to be real in the low light of a summer evening. The kind of color that makes everything else in the bed look slightly washed out by comparison. It blooms in flushes from late spring through autumn. Between flushes, it is quietly building the next one. There is a reason this decision gets made wrong so consistently. Hybrid teas dominate garden center displays because they photograph well in a pot at the point of sale. Nobody is marketing a plant for how it performs in year 3. They are marketing it for how it looks on the trolley on the way to checkout. The repeat flowering shrub roses look comparatively unremarkable in that small black plastic pot. They do not announce themselves the way a hybrid tea bloom does. Their advantage only becomes visible months later, in a garden over a season, which is precisely the time frame that point-of-sale marketing has no interest in. One decision, every season that follows, depends on it. But the variety you choose only matters if what's underneath it is right, and almost nobody gets that part anywhere near correct. Number 19, what you plant in the soil before the rose goes in. Most gardeners dig a hole, drop the rose in, and fill it back in with the same soil they just removed. That is the single biggest missed opportunity in rose growing. An established rose roots 60 centimeters or deeper. The conditions in that soil shape the plant for its entire life. The correct fill is the excavated topsoil mixed with 2 shovelfuls of well-rotted compost, a handful of bone meal, and a pinch of mycorrhizal inoculant dusted directly onto the bare roots before they go in. That fungal dusting looks like nothing. A faint gray powder on wet roots. Within weeks, it becomes an invisible network threading through the surrounding soil, extending the rose's effective root reach many times over. Picture the root system itself as a fist, and the mycorrhizal network as fingers spreading out from it into soil the rose's own roots would never have reached on their own. That is the actual mechanical difference between a rose that establishes in one season and a rose that limps along for 3. Get the hole right once. The rose remembers it for decades. What you just buried disappears completely from view. What goes on top of it next is the part every neighbor can actually see, and most of them are doing it wrong in a way that quietly poisons the plant. Number 18, mulch correctly and the rose feeds itself. 10 centimeters of well-rotted manure or leaf mold spread across the root zone in early spring as the buds are just starting to swell. That is the entire task. Less than an hour, once a year. Leave a clear gap around the stem itself. Mulch, piled against the woody base, invites crown rot. Everywhere else, pile it on. By midsummer, that dark, crumbly layer has been pulled apart by earthworms and soil bacteria into exactly the slow-release feed that carries the rose through its second and third flush. You did the work in March. The plant cashes it in through August. There is something almost satisfying about watching a rose bed in late June. The mulch gone dark and crumbled into the surface, worm casts visible where there were none in spring, and knowing that every bloom appearing through July was paid for months earlier by an hour of work nobody saw you do. That feed only matters if the plant is given a reason to use it on more flowers instead of seeds. And that reason comes down to one small decision made with a pair of secateurs, repeated incorrectly in almost every garden in the country. Number 17, deadhead. Correctly and trigger the next flush within days. Snap a spent bloom off at the neck, the way almost everyone does it, and you leave the swelling hip behind. The plant keeps feeding that hip towards seed. Weeks pass before the next flush even starts. Cut instead to the first 5 leaflet set down the stem. There is a dormant bud waiting there, facing outward, and that single cut removes the dead flower and the entire energy drain of the hip in one motion. Same task, different point on the stem. The gap between flushes drops from 3 weeks to 10 days. Run your eye down any flowering stem on a rose you suspect has been mismanaged, and look for swollen, reddish, slightly bulbous growths just below where old flowers used to sit. Those are the hips quietly siphoning the plant's energy. Cut below them, not above, and the difference shows up within 2 weeks. 10 days sounds fast. It is nothing compared to how fast a single disease can spread once it finds a wet leaf, and almost every gardener is handing it exactly the entry point it needs without realizing. Number 16. The watering method that stops black spot before it starts. Black spot needs standing water on a leaf to germinate. That is the whole vulnerability. Watering can held overhead, sprinkler arcing across the bed, even hard rain bouncing up off bare soil. All of it splashes spores onto the lower leaves. Watering at the base, straight to the root zone, removes the splash mechanism entirely. No fungicide, no spray schedule. Just point the hose lower. Walk past a rose bed the morning after rain and look specifically at the lowest leaves, the ones closest to the soil. Black ring spots there before they appear anywhere higher up the plant is the surest sign that splash, not airborne spread, is the source. Stop the splash, and you have stopped the disease at its point of entry, rather than fighting it after the fact. So the water is no longer the problem. But there is a second, completely different way black spot gets a foothold, and it has nothing to do with how you water at all. It is about where you planted the rose in the first place. Number 15. The rose position that prevents every disease at once. Here is a test you can run in 30 seconds. Hold a wet sheet of paper at the spot where you're thinking of planting. Watch how fast it dries. Dry within minutes. The position has airflow. Still damp after an hour, you have found a fungal incubator, and no amount of feeding or pruning skill will fix what the site itself is doing. Open ground, multiple directions of airflow, no walls pressing in. That is the only formula that matters here. The corners where 2 fences meet are the worst offenders in almost every suburban garden. Sheltered still, and exactly the kind of dead air pocket that keeps a leaf wet for hours after the rest of the garden has dried. If your best looking rose photograph came from a corner like that, the disease pressure is already building, even if you cannot see it yet. Position solves the disease question almost entirely on its own. What it does not solve is shape, and a rose with no shape at all is a rose that will eventually collapse under its own weight, no matter how healthy it is. Number 14. Prune for the structure, not for the book. Every pruning guide gives you one method for every rose. That is part of why so many gardeners follow the instructions precisely and still end up with a rose that sulks. 3 things apply no matter what you are holding the secateurs over. Cut out dead wood completely. Cut out branches that cross and rub, because every rub point is an open door for disease. Cut out the weakest third of stems from the center so light and air can actually reach the middle of the plant. Everything past those 3 is specific to what variety you are standing in front of. Stand back from the plant after these 3 cuts and look at the silhouette rather than the individual stems. A correctly structured rose reads as an open vase shape, light able to pass through the middle rather than getting trapped in a tangle. If you can see daylight through the center of the bush, you have done it correctly. Structure is sorted. Now comes the part almost every commercial product on the garden center shelf is trying and failing to replace. Number 13. The feed that drives repeat flowering better than any other. Nitrogen grows leaves. Phosphorus grows roots. Potassium grows flowers, and it is the nutrient almost nobody applies on purpose. The source is sitting in your fireplace. Wood ash from a clean wood fire runs 5 to 10% potassium by dry weight. A generous handful scattered around each plant in early spring, and again right after the first flush, delivers that boost at exactly the moment the plant is deciding how many buds to set next. It also nudges soil pH upward slightly, which matters in beds that have been acidifying quietly for years. Only use ash from wood that has not been treated, painted, or pressure treated. The trace chemicals in processed wood end up in that ash too, and they end up in your soil right alongside the potassium you actually wanted. A handful of ash from your own fireplace, outperforming a bottle from the shelf, sounds like a stretch. It isn't, But there is something underground making sure that ash and everything else you feed the plant actually gets where it needs to go. Number 12, the fork test that tells you why nothing else is working. Push a garden fork into the soil near an established rose, about 20 centimeters down, and rock it back gently without turning the soil over. If it goes in like the ground is made of clay brick rather than soil, that resistance is the actual reason your feeding program has been underperforming. Compacted soil chokes off the oxygen and water movement that every other secret on this list depends on. You can apply perfect nutrition to a root system that cannot access it. Picture pouring water onto a tabletop instead of into a glass. That is roughly what feeding compacted soil amounts to. The nutrients sit at the surface or run off rather than reaching anywhere near the roots that need them. One gentle rock of the fork, done once in spring before mulching, fixes that. Turning the soil over instead, the way you might in a vegetable bed, severs the feeder roots and sets the plant back. Rock it, don't dig it, so the soil can finally breathe. But none of this matters at all if the rose went into the ground at the wrong moment of the year, which is a mistake that gets made constantly and almost never gets traced back to its real cause. Number 11, when you plant matters as much as how. Same variety, same soil, same gardener. Plant one bare root in November and one containerized in May, and by the following autumn, they will look like two different plants. The November rose spends the entire winter making quiet root contact with the surrounding soil. No demands placed on it, no leaves to support. By the time spring buds break, it already has a head start. The May rose never gets the chance to build. Think of it as the difference between moving into a house in the dead of winter, with months to unpack slowly before life resumes at full speed, versus moving in the middle of a busy week and being expected to host a dinner party the same evening. Dormant planting. That's the entire secret. Timing is free. The next secret costs about as much as a head of garlic, and it does a job that an entire industry has built itself around selling you a substitute for. Number 10, the companion that does more for roses than any fungicide. Garlic around the base of a rose is not an old wives' tale. Sulfur compounds from its roots move into the surrounding soil chemistry and into the rose's own tissue at trace levels, and aphids and spider mites find that tissue measurably less appealing. Plant a circle of cloves in autumn. Harvest the garlic in early summer, just as the rose hits peak bloom. Replant immediately for next year. The two crops share almost nothing in terms of competition. Garlic's shallow, narrow root system occupies a completely different layer of soil from the rose's deep taproot, which is part of why this particular pairing works as cleanly as it does compared to most companion planting advice. One handful of cloves, repeated annually, doing a job that would otherwise come out of a spray bottle. Garlic helps a domesticated rose hold its ground against pests. But somewhere out past the garden fence, wild roses are doing something even more impressive, and they're doing it with no help from anyone at all. Number 9, why wild roses never get black spot. So if black spot is everywhere, why do species roses growing wild from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean shrug it off while a hybrid tea 3 meters away collapses under it? Genetic diversity. Wild populations carry resistance traits that decades of breeding for the perfect bloom quietly bred out. Rosa rugosa and Rosa glauca, and the varieties bred closest to them, kept more of that original toughness than almost anything sold as a modern hybrid. Walk along almost any coastal path in early summer, and you will find Rosa rugosa thriving in pure sand. Salt spray hitting it daily, no irrigation, no feeding, no spray program. Blooming and producing tomato red hips by autumn regardless. Breeders chased beauty. Resistance was the thing left behind. If toughness was the casualty of modern breeding, you would expect the toughest roses left standing to be all over every garden center. They are almost nowhere to be found, and the reason has nothing to do with how well they perform. Number 8, the only truly low-maintenance rose nobody sells. Low maintenance on a garden center label usually just means low maintenance compared to a hybrid tea. That is not the same as actually low maintenance. The Gallicas, Damasks, and Albas flower exactly once, in a single early summer explosion so dense and so fragrant that modern repeat varieties never quite match it. Then for the other 10 months of the year, they sit there, disease resistant, self-sufficient, asking for nothing. No deadheading, no feeding program, no fungicide. A Gallica planted correctly outlives the gardener who planted it. There are documented Gallica plantings well over a century old, still flowering every June in the same spot, having outlasted the houses, the gardeners, and several changes of ownership of the land around them. Nobody markets a plant that generates zero repeat purchases. If a rose that needs nothing can't get shelf space, what does get the prime spot at the front of the store? And is it actually the best rose or just the best marketed one? Number 7. The rose every experienced grower keeps recommending. Ask 10 serious rose growers to name one variety that does everything right, and Gertrude Jekyll comes up more than any other name. June through November, this rose just keeps producing those deep cupped pink blooms, fragrant enough to notice from across a garden. It reaches 2 meters trained as a soft climber, above average disease resistance, full performance by its second season. New roses get marketed on novelty. This one survives on word of mouth, decade after decade, because the people who grow it cannot stop telling other people to grow it too. That is, in a sense, the most reliable review system that exists in gardening. Not a star rating on a website, but a plant that strangers keep recommending unprompted to other strangers, year after year, with nothing to gain from the recommendation themselves. Word of mouth built that reputation. What comes next is a piece of timing knowledge that almost nobody passes on by word of mouth at all, because most gardeners have never noticed the gap exists. Number 6. The timing trick that produces 3 flushes where most gardens get one. Deadhead the tidy way, one fading bloom at a time, over a couple of weeks, and you stretch the gap before the next flush out by weeks. Deadhead all at once instead, the moment roughly 70% of the flush is open, even the blooms still looking decent. The bed looks bare and stripped for a few days. Ugly, briefly. There is a real psychological hurdle here. Cutting off perfectly good flowers feels wasteful in the moment, almost wrong, and most gardeners flinch at the exact point where committing fully would have paid off. Then, the entire plant redirects at once, instead of in dribs and drabs, and the next flush arrives in one coordinated wave, weeks earlier than it would have otherwise. That early flush is also what makes a real third flush possible before frost, instead of one that quietly never finishes. Timing the cut got you 3 flushes instead of 1. The next secret has nothing to do with timing at all. It is about where the bed is standing in relation to the sun, and almost everyone gets it backwards. Number 5. Why the direction your rose faces determines how long it blooms. 6 hours of direct sun a day is the line. Below it, you get 1 decent flush and then leaves, not flowers, for the rest of the season. South-facing beds get the longest run of light and are the safest bet for continuous bloom. East-facing catches morning sun that dries the dew fast, which matters if black spot has been a problem. West-facing sounds fine, but often means a damp morning, followed by hot afternoon sun, which is closer to a recipe for disease than a benefit. North-facing works for exactly one group, the Alba Old Roses, which shrug off shade that would silence anything modern. If you have ever wondered why the single rose tucked into a shaded north corner of an old cottage garden still blooms reliably every June, while everything modern around it sulks, this is almost certainly the variety responsible. Position is locked in the day you plant, but there is a decision that comes even before that, made an entire year ahead of time, and almost nobody waits long enough to make it. Number 4. The preparation that happens before the rose even exists in your garden. Everything up to this point assumed a rose was already going into the ground. This secret happens a year before that. Experienced growers sow a green manure, phacelia, buckwheat, or crimson clover into the bed 6 to 12 months ahead of planting, and dig it in before the rose ever arrives. The clover specifically fixes nitrogen that stays available in that soil for years. Picture the bed in late summer, the year before planting. Waist-high and flowering phacelia, bees working it from dawn to dusk, looking like the least rose-ready patch of ground in the entire garden. That is exactly the point. A rose planted into ground, prepared this way, hits, in its first season, the kind of vigor most gardens don't see until year 3. You're not feeding the rose. You're feeding the soil it hasn't met yet. A year of patience before the plant even arrives buys 3 years of growth on the other end. The next secret asks for almost no patience at all, and it comes from a plant most people go out of their way to avoid touching. Number 3. The free feed. Most gardeners would never guess works this well. Nettles, the stinging kind most people avoid on site, are one of the most nitrogen-dense plants you can find for free. Submerge a bucketful in water, leave it 2 to 3 weeks, and the smell alone will tell you something powerful is happening. Wear gloves for the harvest. The same compounds that make the leaves sting are exactly why the resulting liquid is so potent, and that sting does not fade just because the leaves are sitting in water. Strain it, dilute 1 part to 10, and apply every 2 weeks from spring bud break through the last flush of autumn. Gardeners who have run this side by side against commercial rose feed report results that are equal, sometimes better. It smells like a drain. It works like a fertilizer bill you never have to pay. That smell fades within minutes of application. What happens next, in late August, is far quieter, and it is the single mistake responsible for more disappointing Octobers than any disease on this entire list. Number 2, the mistake in August that kills the flush you want most. Most gardens never see a real October rose, not because the rose can't do it, because of one small thing left undone in late August. As the second flush fades, the plant is biologically ready to start the bud development for an autumn flush, but only if every scrap of energy is going toward flowers, not seed. Leave even a handful of small hips developing from a few missed blooms, and that quiet diversion is enough to weaken or erase the entire third flush. Picture 2 identical roses photographed side by side in late October, one carrying a final flush of bloom against bare trees and the first frost on the grass, the other holding nothing but a scatter of dull orange hips and a few yellowing leaves. The only difference between them happened 10 weeks earlier, in 5 minutes with a pair of secateurs. Strip every spent flower and every developing hip in one pass in late August. No exceptions for the small ones. That single pass is the difference between a garden still blooming at the first frost and one that quietly stopped in September. 19 secrets down. Each one has solved a separate, specific problem. Soil, water, disease, timing, feed. There is one more question left, and it is bigger than any of them. What actually connects all 19? Number 1. Here's the part that changes how you should read everything above it. Every secret on this list, the soil prep, the mulch, the deadheading angle, the wood ash, the nettle tea, works because it is removing something, not adding it. Removing competition for the roots, removing standing water from the leaf surface, removing the seed development drain in August, removing the genetic narrowness that decades of breeding imposed. The roses that bloom from May through November in those gardens are not being managed harder than yours. They are being interfered with less in the specific places where interference does damage, and left alone everywhere else. That is the whole secret, not a better product, not a more complicated schedule. A rose given exactly what it would have found in poor soil on a hillside 200 years ago, and then mostly left to get on with it. The garden center cannot sell you that, so it sells you the spray instead. If this changed how you think about roses, or if you've been losing them for years and just found out why, tell us which secret hit hardest in the comments. Want to see the 20 ground cover plants that replace your lawn entirely and never need mowing? Click on the left. And if you don't want to miss more guides like this one, hit that subscribe button now.